Hello everyone, welcome to Excel with Isaac series, and in this video we'll be looking at pivot tables. Now the idea of pivot tables is to be able to summarize your data sets, whether large or small, in such a way that it's easy to generate insights from. And so in this tutorial, I'll be showing you how we can generate a pivot table, and then once we are done with that, we'll look at the basic structure of the pivot table. Now this portion of the tutorial, I'll say, is the most important part of the tutorial because if you're able to understand the basic structure of how the pivot table works, then regardless of the type of data set you'll be working with, you'll be able to manipulate your pivot table in such a way that you can generate the kind of insights that you want. Under the basic structure of the pivot table, we'll look at what the pivot table fields are, and then I'll explain what the rows, columns, values, and filters are in the pivot table structure. Then once we are done with how the basic structure of the pivot table works, we'll then look at some practical examples of how we can manipulate data using the pivot tables. Then once we are done with that, we'll look at certain key components of the pivot table menus. So under this section, I've created some of the most common features about the pivot table menus that you need to know. And then once we are done with that, we'll move on to a bonus section where I show you how you can count distinct items using the pivot table. So with that, let's begin. So how do we generate a pivot table? I'll be showing you 4 ways you can use to generate the pivot table. So the first way you can generate a pivot table is to first select your data set. Once you select your data set, you come to Insert, and then under Insert, you see Pivot Table. You click on it, and then you click on Pivot Table/Range. When you do that, you get the pop-up asking you for your table range. And because you highlighted the entire data set, Excel has automatically put in the range. And then for whether you want the pivot table to be created on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet, we go with a new worksheet, and then we click on OK. So now this is the first way you can generate a pivot table. Let's delete this. So now let me show you the second way you can generate a pivot table. For the first way, we selected the entire data set. However, if your selection is anywhere within the data set and you still go to Insert Pivot Table from Table Range, Excel is still able to identify your data set because you've made your selection within your data set as at the time that you are creating the pivot table. So as you can see, Excel has selected the entire data set. And again, for whether you want to create a pivot table in an existing worksheet or in a new worksheet, let's select a new worksheet and then click on OK. And we've created a pivot table the second way. Now let's delete the sheet and then create pivot table the third way. Okay, so for the third way, this time around, your selection is not going to be within the data set. And then let's create a pivot table and see how that works. You come to Insert, Pivot Table, and then select from Table or Range. Now, because this time around, your selection was outside the data set, you can see that Excel is unable to identify the range. And for this one, we have to manually come and then select the range. And once we are done with that, we come to New Worksheet, and then we click on OK. And with that, we've created a pivot table the third way. So now let's delete this. And now for the final way to create a pivot table, I'll show you the shortcuts you can use to create a pivot table. So for that one, your selection can be inside or outside the data set. But when it's inside the data set, as you've seen, Excel will help select the range for you. However, when it's outside the data set, you have to manually select your range. So for the fourth way, we use Alt-NV, Enter, and then Excel creates a pivot table on a new sheet for you. So with that, we are done with the 4 ways you can create your pivot table. Let's move on to the next things after you've created your pivot table. So the first thing you notice once you create your pivot table is that Excel generates 2 new menu tabs. And if you click outside the pivot table, see that the menu tabs disappear. If you select inside the pivot table, the menu tabs reappear. Now to your right side as well, you can see that Excel has shown the various pivot table fields. Now these fields are the column headers for your data set. So if you come to your data set, you can see that you have your order ID, order date, up until the sales amount. And if you come to your pivot table, you can see that Excel has put all your column headers here. And now below the pivot table fields, you see 4 sections here being the filter, columns, row, and values. So Excel gives you these sections so that if you want to view anything about your pivot table fields, you can just drag and drop in any of the sections. So if you take the column section, for instance, if you drag, say, country into columns, Excel will find the unique country names and then arrange them in the various column headers. If you take country out and you put continent in columns, Excel will go into your data set and put the various unique continent names in the columns. So that's how the columns work. Anytime you drag into the columns, say the product name, Excel will look for the unique product names and then arrange them in the columns. Now let's move on to the rows. So similar to the columns, if you drag a field to the rows, see that Excel takes the unique contents of that field and then arranges them in the rows. So you can play around with this. You can try any other field, say the customer name. You see that Excel has taken the customer names and then placed them in the rows. So that's how the rows also works. Now let's move on to the filters. So say you have your customer names here and you wanted to filter by continent or country. All you need to do is grab the country field and then drop it in filters. And then Excel gives you a filter in your pivot report. So then you can come now and then filter for your country and then see how it looks like. So let's drag country out and then put product category there. You can see that Excel gives you a filter for your product categories. And if you select for just accessories, Excel will filter the pivot table for customers who bought accessories. So that's about the filters. Now for the value section, if you drag any field that is not a number into the value section, what Excel typically does is that it goes to count the number of rows in your data set. So now because the order ID field, if you come into your data set, these are not numbers, these are text. So because of that, if you drag it in the value field, what Excel does is that it comes to count the number of rows in your data set. And as you can see, we have about 200 rows in our data set shown down here. So if you go back to the pivot, you can see that Excel is counting the number of rows. So if you do the same for any of the other fields that are not numbers, you see that Excel is counting the rows for those fields as well. So again, by default, if you put a field that is not a number inside the value section, Excel by default counts the number of rows in your data set. Now, if you put a field that is a number inside your data set, so for instance, if I come to my data set and you come up, the sales amount field, the quantity and the unit price, see that these are numbers. If you go back to your pivot and you drag, say, the sales amount inside the value section, so what Excel does is that it sums that field and then shows you the value. So as you can see, by default, if I put in a number in the value section, Excel sums the field for me. If I put in, say, the unit price in the value section as well, you see that Excel has summed the unit price column. And if I put in the quantity inside the value section, you can see that Excel has summed the quantity column. So that's how the value section works. So now let me recap the sections again. So for the column section, Excel will find the distinct items in those columns and then arrange them in the columns. If you drag to the rows, Excel will find the distinct items in that pivot field and then arrange them in the rows. If you put the field on filter, Excel will place a filter in your pivot and then you can filter out certain portions of your data set. And if you put the field in the value, if it is not a number, Excel will give you the count of rows of your data set. However, if it is a number, by default, Excel will aggregate that field and then show you the results. So I recommend you play with the dragging and dropping feature just to get more understanding of how the sections work. And once you're done with that, move on to the practice section and then see how we can use the pivot table to be able to get insights into our data without the need for writing complex formulas. So now let's use pivot tables to be able to answer some questions about our data sets. I've structured the examples in 3 sets. So these are first sets of examples. And then when you scroll down, these are second set of examples. And then a third set of examples. If you're able to go through all of these examples to solidify your understanding of pivot tables, and regardless of the data sets that you'll be working in, you'll be able to apply these concepts to be able to get the results that you're looking for. Another thing I did with the examples is that you can see that I've spaced them out because I don't want the pivot tables to overlap each other. So now let's proceed. The first thing that we need answered is the total sales, total orders, or total quantity. And in order to do that, we first need to go to our data set. And now we need to generate a pivot table. So the way in which I like to generate my pivot table is to use the pivot table shortcut. which is Alt NV enter. Now once you do that, you get a pop-up and you can see that Excel has highlighted your data range for you. And you can just quickly scroll down to see if Excel has selected the entire table range. You can see that Excel has done that. The next thing is to decide on where you want the pivot table to be placed. In this case, I want it to be placed in an existing sheet, which is the practice sheet. So I come to practice and then I select this cell and then I hit OK. So as you can see, Excel has created my pivot table. And if I click outside the pivot table, you see that we lose access to the pivots. If I click within the pivot table, see that the pivot table menus are here and then our field lists are here. So now the first thing that we need answered is the total sales, total orders, or total quantities. Now for the total sales, remember that column has numbers, and so we want to sum the total sales amount. What we do is that we come to our pivot fields and then we drag sales to values. And once we do that, we can see that Excel has given us the total sales from our data set. Now let's just format this to look nicer so that it's easy to read. I have a video on cell formatting, so if you want more understanding of how you can beautify your Excel numbers and make them look more professional, I recommend you check that video out. So now let's continue. So for our total orders, if you take a look at our data set, this column represents the orders that have come through. So you want a count of how many orders have come through. In order to do that, remember that the order column are not numbers, they are text. And so when you drag that field into the values, Excel is going to count the total number of rows in your data set. So we come back to our practice, and for the total orders, we come and grab the order ID and then put them in values. And by default, Excel has counted the total number of orders. Now, if you want a summation of the total quantities, so we just come for the quantities and we drop them in values and we get the total quantities. So with that, we've been able to finish the first example, which was to find the total sales or orders or quantities. Now let's move on to the next example, which is the same thing. However, we want it on a country level. Now, one of the cool things about the pivot table is that if you are trying to generate a pivot table from an existing data set, you can come for the initial pivot table that you created. And one of the ways you can select the entire pivot table is to come to Pivot Table Analyze. You click on Select and then you select Entire Pivot Table. So once you select the entire pivot table, you can copy the pivot table with Control C, and then you can move on to a new example and then Control V. And then we've pasted our pivot table. We no longer have to go to our data set to generate the pivot table all over again. So for the second example, we want the total sales or orders or quantity, but we want to see the countries that they are coming from. And if we want to do that, one of the ways we can do that is to put the countries in the rows so that we see all the unique countries listed in the rows. So we come for the country field and then we drop it in rows. And just like that, we've been able to break down the sales amounts, the order, and then the quantities per the countries. And one of the things I recommend you do anytime you're working in pivot tables is to validate your numbers whenever you generate insights. So for instance, for the total sales amount being 749,000, let's go back to our data set and then confirm if the sales amount is really 749,000. And as you can see down here, the total sales amount is 749,000 and the total count of rows is 200. Now we can also validate another field, which is say the country Nigeria, 115K for total sales. So we come to our data set and then we look for Nigeria. So we filter out Nigeria, we click on OK. And then let's sum the sales amount for Nigeria. That's what 115,308. So let's take off our filters again and then go back to our pivot table and see that Nigeria is 115. So we validated at least the total sales and then one country. So with that, we are now in the second example. Let's move on to the third example. So for the next example, we want the total sales, total orders, quantities per continent, per country. So what we do is come to the previous pivot table, go to Pivot Table Analyze, and then we select the entire pivot table, and then we copy with Control C, we come here, and then we paste. So now I've replicated the pivot table. And now since you now want to break down the orders, the quantity and the sales amount per the continent before the country, all we do is come for the continent field and then drop it in rows. And just like that, we've been able to add the continent and then the country. If we interchange the continent and the country, The country will now lead, and then the continent will come as a sub. So let's reverse this back. Continent and then country. It's actually very simple. All you do is drag and drop the fields that you want to see, and then Excel handles the rest. So again, let's just validate one of the figures. Let's take Ghana 124,937. We go back to our data set, put in the filter, and then we look for Ghana. And then for Ghana, we send the sales amount. That's 124,937. So now let's take off the pivots and then go back to our practice. That's 124,937. So with that, we are done with this example. Let's move on to the next example. So for the next example, we want the total sales or the quantities. However, we also want to include the product name this time around. So we go back to our previous pivot table. Remember, since we are working with the same data set, we can still come back for the pivot table and then make a copy of it. We come to pivot table, analyze, we come to select, and then we select the entire pivot table, Control C to copy. We come to this cell and then Control V to paste the pivot table. And now if you want to include the product name, I think by now you should be able to figure this out. So all you do is grab the product name and then you come and drop it in the rows. So as you can see, we've included the product name, but this time around, let's bring the product name to the lowest level. So we have our continent, then we have our country. And for each country, these are the product names for each country. You can actually drop the product name anywhere. If you decide to bring the product name before the country, let's see what happens. So what will happen is that you have your continent, then now the product name becomes the next thing. And then for each product, we get the country breakdown. For the next product, the country breakdown. So it's really up to you and how you want to visualize the data. You can decide to bring product name at the last category, or you can decide to bring product name at the first category or second category. So now let's move on to the next example. So for our next example, we need to find the average sales or average quantities. And for that one too, let's go back to one of the smaller pivot tables, say this one. We come to pivot table, analyze, select entire pivot table, copy this, and then let's come and paste that here. Okay, so now we have our pivot table. So because this time around we are not breaking it down per the continent and country, we can take this and this off. Now the next thing that we need to do is also take off the other. And now if you want the average sales and average quantities, by default, anytime you drag the sales amount to the value section, Excel automatically sums if it's a number, and if it's a text, it counts the number of rows. Now, if you do not want to see the sum and say you want the average, what you do is that you come to the arrow here at the value section, click on it, and then select value field settings. Now, when you do that, you see a pop-up that comes, and then you come and select average, and then click on OK. Now, once you do that, Excel gives you the average sales amount. Now, let's do the same for the quantity. So we come and click on this arrow, we press the value field settings, and then we come and click on average, and then we click OK. So once we do that, we also get the average quantity and then average sales amount. Now, let's come to our data set and then just validate this. So we highlight all the sales amounts, and then we are seeing the averages, 3749. So let's go back to our practice. That's 3749. For the quantity, the average quantity is 6. So we come back to our data set, go to quantities, and check this out. That's 6. So yes, we've been able to validate our numbers. So the purpose of this example was to show you that by default, when you drag your numbers into the values, Excel automatically gives you the sum if it's a number, but if it's a text, it gives you the count of rows. Now, if you do not want the sum and you want the average, all you do is come to the more options, which is the arrow. You select on it and comes a value field, and then you select the average. So that's how you find the averages of numbers. Now, if you wanted to find the average per the continent, per the country, all you do is grab the country field and then place it in the rows, and you get the averages across your countries. It's as simple as just dragging and dropping. So now let's move to the final example of the first section of examples. So the next thing that we need to find is the top 5 sales per product names. Now I intentionally gave this example so that you know how to be able to perform your top N of anything using the pivot tables. So this example is just limited to top 5. However, you can apply it for top 10, top 20, and so on and so forth. So then the first thing that we need to do is to again make a copy of our pivot table, select this pivot table, click on pivot table, analyze, click on select entire pivot table. We copy this and then we come here and then we paste. So first we need to take off the country from rows and then put the product names in rows. So now we have all our product names. And the next thing is to take off the quantity from values. And then for the average sales, let's go back and then with the options, bring this back to a summation. So we come here and click on sum and then click on OK. So now we have our sales amount. Now, if you want to find the top 5, the first thing I'll recommend is let's sort this from highest to lowest. In order to sort from highest to lowest, you click on this arrow key here, and then you come to more sort options. So once you click on more sort options, you get a pop-up that gives you 3 options. The first one is a manual sorting option. The second one is ascending. So ascending means that you are sorting from lowest to highest. And then descending means that you are sorting from highest to lowest. So for this instance, we want to sort from highest to lowest. And we don't want to sort per the product names. We want to sort per the sales amount. So we select sales amount and then we click on OK. And as you can see, Excel has applied the sorting to our pivot table. So the next thing that we need to do is to be able to find the top 5 sales. Now to find the top 5 sales, we come back to this arrow, we click on this, and then we come to value filters. Now when you come to value filters, you see that the last option you have your top 10, and then you select your top 10. And once this pop-up opens, you have about 4 options. So the first option looks at whether you want to sort from top to bottom, you want to sort from the top. And then we want the top 5. We can either use the counter or we can type in 5. And now what we want to sort is the item. So we are sorting these items based on their sales amount. So everything is fine. And then we click on OK. So now once you do that, you can see that Excel has truncated the table and given you the top 5 product names per sales amount. Now, if you had about 8 sales amounts, but under the 5th position, they all had the same value in terms of sales amount, the top 5 sales will technically have been 8 product names. So the top 5 does not necessarily mean 5 items all the time. Where the 5th position is a shared rank, you see that Excel will show all those fields that are sharing the same value for making them the 5th position. So with that, we are done with the first section of examples. Let's move on to the second section of examples so that we gain more understanding of how the pivot table works. So let's move on to the next set of examples. I've had to move set 2 and set 3 examples to a new sheet because of the volume of data that we'll be handling. So for the set 2 set of examples, we need to find the daily sales from our data sets using the pivot table. Now, how do we go about this? And for this example, we are not going to be copying an existing pivot. Let's go back to our original data set and then let's create a new pivot table. We can do that by selecting the entire data set. Remember in the beginning, we talked about the 4 ways you can generate a pivot table. It's not really cast in stone that you have to use this particular way. Just use the approach that's comfortable for you because at the end of the day, you're still generating a pivot table. So in this particular case, I've selected the entire data set. I come to insert and I select pivot table from table/range. Once the pop-up comes, you can see that Excel has selected the entire range for us. Now for where we want the table to be placed, let's go for existing worksheet. And now for the location, let's come to practice set 2, 3 sheets and then click on this cell and then click on OK. So again, Excel has given us our pivot table. If we click outside the pivot table, we lose access to the pivot table menus. And then when we click inside the pivot table, we gain access to the pivot table menus. Now to find the daily sales, the first thing that we can do is we can either put the order date in rows or we can decide to put the order date in columns. If you put it in rows, Excel arranges the order dates this way. However, let me undo this with Ctrl Z. And then let's put the order date in columns. So that when you put the order dates in columns, the first thing you notice is that the dates are not showing in the way you will expect the dates to be showing. If you come back to your data set, you can see that the dates are showing as day, month, and year. But if you come to your practice data set, you're seeing that Excel has grouped the days in months, days, and other dates out of the date field that you dragged here. Now, in a lot of cases, you will not like to view the dates this way. You want to view it the way it's in your data set. So if you want that view, you come back into your pivot, select on any of the cells within the pivot table, and then you right click and then you select ungroup. Now once you do that, you can see that Excel has ungrouped the dates and I'm showing you the dates in the way that you want it to appear. Now there's a faster way that I can show you to do this. Let's take the order date out. And the other way I use is usually when I drag the order date into the columns field. And now this comes, all I do is I hit Control Z to undo, and then Excel ungroups it for me. So now we've been able to list the various order dates. And now in order to find the total sales, again, the sales column in our data set is made up of numbers, and typically the numbers portion in your data is what you drag into the values. So let's select the sales amount and then drag it into values. And I've been able to find the daily sales from our data set. Again, I like to validate. So let's validate for 1st January 2025. That's 3552. So we come to our data set. Let's put a filter on the data set and then let's filter for 1st January 2025. So filter for 2025, 1st January, and then we click on OK. And now when we check the sales amount, see that it's 3552. And so we have the right result. So let's remove the filters and go back to our practice data set. So now we are done with the first example. The purpose of this example was to demonstrate how working with dates can be using the pivot tables. Usually Excel groups the dates. So if you want Excel to ungroup the dates, this is how you can get Excel to ungroup the dates, and then you can find whatever you need to find using your pivot table. So with that, let's move to the next example in set 2. So for the next example, we want to find the daily sales. However, we want it on a country level. So in order to do that, let's go back up to the previous pivot that we did. And now let's copy this pivot and then send it down. So we come to pivot table, analyze. We come to select. We click on the entire pivot table. Click on copy. Then we scroll down. We come to this section and then we click on paste. And I've been able to make a copy of the pivot table over here. So if you want the sales per country, all we do is we grab the country from the fields list and then we drag it into rows. And once we do that, Excel has given us the breakdown of the sales on a country by country basis. Now, because of how the data set has been structured, we are not seeing a lot of sales, but if we had more data in our data set, you'd have seen all the countries being populated. So with that, let's move on to the next example, which is to find the daily sales per country, and then let's filter by the continent. So in this example, we need the continent as a filter for the daily sales by the countries. And for this, we come up to our previous pivot table. We click on pivot table, analyze, come to select entire pivot table. We copy this. We come down here and then we paste. So now we are looking for the daily sales per country and then we want to filter by the continent. So what we do is we come to the pivot table fields and then we drag continent into filters. So once we drag the continent into filters, we have our filter on top of our pivot table. And if we want to filter by Africa, we click on this drop down and then we select Africa and then we click on OK. So as you can see, we filtered the sales down per the countries that belong to Africa. If you want to filter by the countries in Europe, click on Europe and then click on OK. And as you can see, filtered by Europe. If you want multiple continents, you can click on the filter and then you check this option, select multiple items, and then we can add, say, Asia and then North America and click on OK. And as you can see, we filtered the data by the countries that belong to the filters that we applied. Now, one other thing to note is that when I was pasting the pivot table, I left some spaces because I wanted more room to be able to manipulate the pivots. Now, see what happens if I try to add another filter. Say I want to filter by the product category. So I add the product category to the filters. Now you can see that Excel is giving me a spill error. And what this simply means is that Excel cannot show the pivot table because there's some data already filling up the space where the pivot table should be. So anytime you see spill in Excel, it means that Excel is unable to show the information because there's something in one of the cells that is blocking the information from showing. So what we can do to fix this is to take away the content that is blocking the pivot. So let's select this header and then let's move this up about 2 spaces. And as you can see now, your pivot has room to show. So anytime you're copying and pasting a pivot and you want to apply multiple filters, just make sure that you have enough room to be able to manipulate your pivot table. So with this, we are done with set 2 of our examples. Now with the set 2 examples, we're looking at instances where you had to work with dates and then apply certain filters to your pivot table. We learned that when you're applying the dates, by default, Excel groups the dates, and in order to ungroup them, you can right-click on the pivot and then select ungroup. Or once you drag the dates portion into the column or row, you just click Ctrl-Z to undo, and then Excel will ungroup the dates for you. So now let's move on to the third set of examples. So the first example in the set 3 practice is how to calculate a 10% discount on the total sales. So now to calculate a 10% discount on the total sales, let's come back to our data set. And then let's insert a new pivot. We come to insert pivot table, select from the range. And because our selection is within the data set, Excel has already highlighted the range for us. And now for where we want the pivot table to be, let's select existing worksheet and then go to our practice set to click here and then click on OK. And now we have our pivot table. So now let's bring the sales amount into our values to see the total sales. So now we have our total sales, which is 749,836. And we need to calculate a 10% discount on our total sales. How do we do that with our pivot table? So first you come to pivot table, analyze, and then you come to field, items, and sets. You click on this and then you select calculated field. So now in the calculated field pop-up, we name the new field that we want and then we insert the formula to calculate what we want. So for the name of the field, let's input discount. And for the formula, we want a 10% times the sales field. So we come for the sales amount and then we insert the field and then we click on add. Now once we click on add, you can see the new field shown in our pivot table fields. And then we click on OK. And once you click on OK, Excel adds the field to the value and you can see it here. So this is a 10% on the sales amount. If you wanted to confirm, you can just do the new sales amount divided by the total sales amount. And that's a 10%. So now let's take this off. I've been able to calculate a 10% of the total sales here. And if you wanted to see that 10% across the various countries, again, all you do is you come for the country and then drag two rows. And as you can see, the 10% has been applied to the various countries as well. If you want to see it on a continent level, you can drag the country out and then bring the continent into rows. You can see that the 10% has still been applied for the various continents as well. Now, how do you delete the calculated field that you have? So in case maybe you had created so many calculated fields that you do not want anymore, how do we delete the calculated field? You come back to your pivot table, analyze, select field, items, and sets, and then click on calculated field. Then under the name box, you click on this drop down, and then you select the calculated field that you created, and then you just hit delete, and then OK. So now once you apply that, you see that Excel has taken off the calculated field that we had, and it's no longer appearing in the fields list. So with that, let's move on to the next example. So for our next example and the final example in our practice, we need to show the contribution per country on the sales amount. So how do we do this? Let's go back up to the previous pivot table, come to pivot table, analyze, come to the select, and then choose the entire pivot table. Let's copy this and then let's come and paste this here. So now we have our pivot table. Let's take off the continent field and we have our sales amount. So now how do we find contribution per country on the sales amount? So let's grab the country and then drop it in rows. So now we have our sales amount on a country level. And I want to find how much each country is contributing to this total amount. So in order to do that, let's go back to the sales amount and then let's drag the sales amount again into the value section of our pivot. So that's the beautiful thing about the value section. You can drag whatever you're calculating in the value section multiple times in the pivot. So I can drag the value section again in the pivot. And I have 3 of that in the pivot. So now let's take this off and then we are back to 2. So in order to calculate the percentage contribution per the country, you come to the second sales amount. So you right click on the second sales amount and then come to show values as. Now, because you want a percentage of the sales amount to the total, you select percentage of grand total. So once you click on this, Excel gives you the contribution per country to the sales amount. And now if you wanted to validate, say, Denmark's contribution, you can manually do that here as equal to Denmark sales divided by the grand total, and you hit enter. And that's equal to. And now let's format this to 2 decimal places, and we can see that the calculation is accurate. So this is how you can calculate contribution of the sales amount on a country basis. And so with that, we are done with our final example. Now let's move on to certain key features about the pivot table. So in this section, I'll be showing you some of the key features that I use anytime I'm working in pivot tables. There are so many features about the pivot table that you can learn about, but these are some of the common ones you may find yourself needing to use anytime you're working with pivot tables. So the first feature that I'll show you is how to name your pivot tables. And to do that, when you create your pivot table under the pivot table analyze, you should see the pivot table name here. And I'll always recommend you name your pivot tables because sometimes you may be working with multiple pivot tables, and it's very good to be able to know which pivot table you're working in. There's also another benefit for naming pivot tables, which I'll show you when we get to pivot table slices. So in order to name your pivot table, you just come up here and then you can type, say, your pivot table name. And I like using the suffix _piv because I'm working with pivot tables. So I've named this pivot table a sales piv and I hit enter. So now the next feature I want to show is how do you hide or show your pivot table field list items. So by default, anytime you generate the pivot table, Excel shows your field list items and then the sections below. If you do not want to show these items, all you do is you come up here under the pivot table analyze and then you click on fields list. Now once you do that, you see that the fields list disappear. If you click on it again, it comes back. Another way that you can just click on the close and then disappears. Now once you want it to appear again, you click on this and the fields list returns. Now speaking on the fields list, by default, Excel gives you this layout. However, you can also change the layout to suit how you want to work. And if you want to change the layout, you come to this gear icon here, you click on it, and then you can say choose this layout. And personally, this is a layout I like using because if I'm working with so many columns, I can see all the columns here. But if you want to change the layout, you can always come here, select any of the layouts that will work for you. So by default, this is the layout that Excel gives you. So the next thing we'll look at is how to refresh the pivot table. So using this pivot, let me drag the country to rows. And now let me drag the sales to values. So now you can see your sales amount. So if say I make a change in my original data set, so I come to my original data set and say I decide to change the sales amount to say 1 million. Now how do I make this change flow into the pivot table? All I do is I come back to my pivot table, I come to pivot table analyze, and I click on refresh. And once I do that, you can see that the sales figure has gone up because I've added about 1 million to USA, and we can see reflected. So you just come to pivot table analyze and you click on refresh to see the new changes that have happened in your data set. Now another thing with the refresh is that sometimes you may be wanting to add more information to your data set. So how do you do that? So let's go back to our data sets, and at the side, I have new data that we can add to our existing data. So we can copy this data, we come to the end of our data sets, and then we paste it over here. Now for the additional data sets, I've added a country, Fiji. So how do we make this change reflect in our pivot table? So let's come back to our pivot table. We select our pivot table, and then our pivot table analyze, let's select change data source. So when you click on change data source, Excel brings you back to your original data source that you selected. And now Excel is asking you to define the range. Now because we've added new data, this range needs to expand. You can come back and then select the entire range again, but this time around, we are including the new information that we added. So once you do that, you click on OK. And as you can see, Excel has included Fiji to my pivot table. If you do this and Fiji doesn't get added, all you can do is hit the refresh, and then Excel will refresh the pivot table for you. So another way of changing a data set is maybe you have an existing data set. Say this data set was data for, say, a different month, and I wanted to generate a new pivot table using different data, but they have the same column headers. All you can do is make a copy of this pivot table by clicking on the pivot table, come to select, entire pivot, copy this, and then say let's paste this here. And now if you want to change the source of this data set, the first requirement is that the column headers should be the same as the existing data set. So we come to Pivot Table Analyze, then we select Change Data Source. Then rather than selecting this data source, say if this was a new data set, we come up here and then we select this new data set as a new data set for the table. And then we click on OK. Now once you do that, you see that you've generated an entirely new pivot table using a different data set by having the same columns. So that's about changing the data source and refreshing your pivot table. So now let me take this off and then we delete. So the next thing is the auto fit column feature. So say you've generated your pivot table and then you decide to adjust the columns. Anytime you come and hit on the refresh, by default, the pivot table resets the column width. If I increase the column width again and then I click on refresh, see that the pivot table has reset the column width. So how do we get around this? All you do is select the pivot table and then you right click and then come to pivot table options. Another way you can get to pivot table options is by coming to the pivot table analyze and selecting on these options. So once you do that, you get this pop-up and then you come down here and come and unselect this option, which is auto fit column width on update. So once you uncheck this option, you can click on OK. And now when I adjust the column width and then click on refresh, you see that the column width is still kept intact. So the next feature that I like to show is a feature that most people want to turn off, which is a generate get pivot data. So by default, anytime you generate a pivot table, that option is always on. And if say you wanted to perform a manual calculation on your pivot table, so let's try and add 1,000 to each of the sales amounts for the countries. So that will be equal to, we select the sales amount and then we add 1,000. Now see what happens when we try to drag down. You see that rather than the formula applying for the other countries, it's still holding the Denmark data and then repeating that across because this get pivot data option is on. Now the idea of the get pivot data is to help writing dynamic formulas. But for this tutorial, I'll not be covering dynamic formulas. So how do you turn this get pivot data off such that when you write a manual formula and you drag down, the formula applies to the cells as you drag down. So in order to do that, let me first delete all of this. You click on your pivot table, you come to pivot table analyze, and then under this option of the pivot table, you click on this arrow key, and you can see that the generate get pivot data is on. So you click on it to turn it off. Now once you've turned it off, let's try writing the formula again and see if it works. So it's equal to the sales for Denmark plus 1,000. And then now let's drag downwards. And you can see that now your formula is being applied to all the cells as you're dragging down. So now let's take this off. So the next feature is the pivot table slices. So think of the pivot table slices as a filter that you can see. And then when you click on it, it makes changes to your pivot table. So in order to generate your pivot table slices, all you do is click on your pivot table, come to pivot table analyze, and then select insert slicer. So once you select that, Excel gives you a pop-up asking you which field in your data set do you want to use as a filter. So say if you want to use the continent as a filter, you select continent and click on OK. And then you can see that Excel has brought the continent slicer. So similar to the filter, however, this slicer is more visible. So now if you wanted to filter data by African continent, you just click on Africa and can see that the slicer has filtered by African continent. If you want to filter by North America, you can always come and click on it and then you see North America being selected. If you want to remove the filters, you can click on this button here and the filters will be removed. And the cool thing about the slicer is that if you create multiple pivot tables coming from the same data sets, your slicer can affect all those data sets. So for instance, if I make a copy of this pivot table, I select the entire pivot table and I make a copy down here. And for this copy, rather than the sales amount, say I wanted to see the sum of the quantities over here. Now the way to connect the slicers to these two pivot tables is by coming to the slicer, by clicking on the slicer, and then you select report connections. So once you do that, you get this pop-up and all you have to come and do is to check these two boxes. Checking these two boxes means that you are connecting the slices to these two pivot tables. And this is where naming your pivot tables come handy because sometimes you may be generating different pivot tables using different data sets. And if you do not have the names for the pivot tables, it will be very difficult to know which pivot table you want the slicer to affect. So naming your pivot tables will help you to know which pivot table you want your slicer to affect. And once you check those boxes, you come and click on OK. So now if I select Europe, you see that the slicer is affecting both the first pivot table and the second pivot table. So this is not limited to just two pivot tables. For the sake of this example, I'm using two pivot tables. However, I can generate many pivot tables and then connect your slicer to all those pivot tables. That way, when you try filtering your pivot table, you realize that the filter is affecting all of your pivot tables. So with that, I'm done with the pivot table slices. Let's move on to the next set of features, which is the pivot table design menu. So now the next section I'll be looking at is the pivot table design menus. So let's generate a pivot table with our data sets. We come to our data set, we come to insert, pivot table from range, and then existing location. Let's come back to our sheet and then select a cell and then click on OK. So I've generated our pivot table. Now the purpose of the report layout is to change the appearance of the pivot table. So for instance, let's drop our sales amount in values, and then let's come for our country and put that in rows, and then come for the product category and put that also in rows. Now you see that by default, the layout that Excel gives you when you keep adding to the rows is a cascaded view. If you want to change this layout, all you do is come to design, come to report layout, and say you want it in a tabular form. You select tabular form. And then Excel changes the layout and places the product category in its own column, the country in its own column, sort of like a table. So by default, this is how the view looks like. I can come back to your report layout and then select repeat all items. That way the items here are repeated across. And if you do not want this layout, you can always come back here and then play with the layout to see which layout works for you. But what usually works for me is the show in tabular form, and then I come here and I repeat all items so that I can see everything about my pivot table. And the next thing I like to show is the subtotals. So when you generate a pivot table and then add in the rows, you see that you have various subtotals in your data set. And if you want to take this off, all you do is come to the design tab, come to subtotals, and then you can select do not show subtotals. Now, once you do that, you see that all the subtotals have disappeared. So now let's bring our product categories to columns. And once you do that, you can see that Excel is showing the grand total for the columns and then showing the grand total for the rows. If you want to turn off this grand total, maybe you do not want to show the grand totals, all you do is you come up to grand totals and then you have four different selections. If you select off for rows and columns, Excel is going to take off all the grand totals for the rows and columns. If you come back to grand totals and select on for rows and columns, Excel puts the grand totals back. If you come back to grand totals and select on for rows only, Excel is only going to show the totals for the rows because these are the rows. So Excel show the totals for the rows. So if you select on for rows only, you see that only the grand totals for the rows remain. And if you come back to your grand totals and select on for columns only, Excel show only the totals for the columns because these are the columns. So if you select on for columns only, Excel shows the grand totals for only the columns. So these are the main things I wanted to show you about the pivot design menu. It gives you more flexibility as to how you want your pivot layout and totals to appear in your pivot table. So let's look at some key features. We'll start with renaming column headers. So for that, let me take off the product category. So say you've dragged your sales amount into values, but you do not like the way the pivot table is showing sum of sales. Maybe you wanted to call it total amount. You can always come to the header and then type total amount and it will work. Once you rename it, you realize that down here in the values, the name has changed. However, in the pivot table fields, the original name still shows. So you just have to be mindful when you're naming the column headers. That way you don't get confused and then you name a field and then later you're unable to know which field it belongs to. Now the next thing that we can look at is custom rearranging items in a pivot. So now let me grab my product and then drop it here. If you do not like the arrangement of the way the products are, you can easily move them around. So say I want to move the accessories to the end of the pivot, I can grab the accessories and then come to the edge of the cell. See that the icon has changed shape. If I come out, see that the icon has changed shape. So the shape you are looking for is the shape that looks like a cross. You click and hold, and then you drag to where you want to drop it, and then let go. And then you've changed the position. You can also work with the row items as well. If I want to move Nigeria to before Germany, I can select Nigeria, hover on the border, click and hold, and then move it up before Germany. And just like that, I've been able to move the rows and also the columns as well. Now, the final feature I'd like to show is how you can delete the pivot table. I've already been doing that as we've been going along. So in order to delete the pivot table, you come to pivot table, analyze. You come to select entire pivot table, and then you just hit your delete button. Another way you can delete the pivot table, let me just undo this, is to select the entire pivot table area, and then you hit the delete button. So with that, I've shown you some of the key features that I use typically when I'm dealing with pivot tables. I recommend you practice these features a lot so that you get the hang of it. And also you experiment and then test what works, what doesn't work. Don't be afraid to just experiment. Try and then see what works for you and what doesn't work as well. So with that, we can move on to the bonus, which is how do we count these things using the pivot table. So if you take a look at the data sets here and you look in the product, you realize that some of the items are duplicating. So if you want to know what is the unique count of items in this list, how do we do that with the pivot table? So in order to generate the pivot table, let's select our data and then we come to insert pivot table from table or range. And as you can see, Excel has highlighted the range for us. As to where we want the pivot table to be placed, let's select existing worksheets and then select the cell. Now before you press OK, there's one thing that you need to do anytime you want to count distinct. You need to come and check this option, which is add this to the data model. Without checking this option, what we're about to do will not work. So we check the add this to the data model and then we click on OK. So once you do that, Excel generates a pivot table and you can see your pivot table fields over here. So now how do we count these things using the pivot table? So what you do is you grab your product and then place it in values. Remember, by default, if you are dragging anything in values and it is not a number but is text, Excel counts the number of rows. So when we drop the product into the values, as you can see, Excel is counting the number of rows in our data set, which is 15 items, as you can see down here. So let's go back to our pivot. Now this count is not unique. Excel is only counting the total number of rows in our data set. If you want Excel to count the rows for only the distinct items in the product, we come back to our values and on this arrow, we click on it. Under the value field setting, let's click on this option. And then when the pop-up comes, you scroll down and then select distinct count and click on OK. So once you do that, you can see that Excel has given us the unique number of items in the data set and counted the rows for us. So we have 6 unique items in the data set. And one of the ways we can validate this is to copy this, come here, paste, and then let's come to data. We select remove duplicates, and then let's remove duplicates from column H. We click on OK. And as you can see, Excel has removed duplicates. So when we count this number of items, we have 6 items. So just like that, we've been able to count distinct items in a list. If you've been able to make it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and share with anyone you think this knowledge will be helpful to. And with that, I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.